Okay, thank you to all of you who are here. I'm glad to have some of you with us tonight, and I hope that more people decide to show up here in the next few minutes because it still seems like some of you are not quite sure on this paper, on what you're supposed to be doing, on how you're supposed to go about doing it. A whole number of different things that you might be able to get something out of this to help you as you're revising this weekend, in the coming days. I know we're still doing peer review for some of you tomorrow in class, but hopefully this gives you a little bit more of a sense of what you're supposed to do and you can work with it in the future. So, the book that I decided to work with it's called The Sign of the Four, and it's Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's second Sherlock Holmes book. I read his first, A Study in Scarlet, earlier this year, and I decided that this was a good opportunity to read the second one and familiarize myself a little bit more with his work and learn a little bit more about the world's greatest detective. So I read that book, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. And what I'm going to go over is I'm going to go over a summary a little bit, give you guys a brief rundown of what the book's about. I'm going to go over the thesis that I developed for it, as well as whether or not I would recommend the book to anyone, and then go through some points that I would try to make or try to support, provide evidence for in a paper in order to support the idea that whatever I decide should be the case as to whether or not to read this book. Is anyone familiar with this particular book or any of the Sherlock Holmes stories at all? Well, I know that everyone has heard of him. I'm sure it's the name is synonymous with crime solving and detective work and everything at this point. So it's unlikely that you haven't heard the name. But if you haven't read any of Doyle's books or read any of the original Sherlock stories, then you may not be as familiar with it as you could be, or maybe should be, or maybe should not be, depending upon what your take or feelings are about detective stories and about Sherlock Holmes and all of that. But okay, so you know who he is, which is good. So let's talk about the book a little bit. I'm going to give you a little bit more summary than what you should be giving in your papers because I want you to be able to get a sense of this book and know kind of what I'm talking about. So, the book is in continuation of the stories of Sherlock Holmes and his partner, Dr. John Watson. And in this case, they are brought this weird occurrence of a young lady named Mary Morstan wanting to know what happened to her father and wanting to know why she's been getting these beautiful pearls sent to her in the mail one at a time from a strange address who she's not familiar with and doesn't really know what to make of it. And so, after a little work and after going to meet the sender, the Holmes and Watson and Mary find out that it's from a man named Thaddeus Sholto, whose father worked with Morstan's father in the British Army, serving in India for a number of years. And as it turns out, the Morstan Sholto pairing in India came across a very extensive treasure, and they stole it from its rightful owners and made off with it. Sholto ended up taking it for himself, and Morstan should have gotten some, but he didn't. So Thaddeus had been sending Mary some of the treasure as a sort of reparation for their father, for his father's bad way. So after learning that Sholto has been sending her this treasure, they learn that the man has a twin brother, and when they go to the brother's house, the brother is dead. And so they're trying to figure out why Bartholomew Sholto is dead. And Sherlock does his investigating all the time, keeps finding clues about this thing called the Sign of the Four, which is just a little marking on some documents in some notes that Morstan had, that Sholto's had, and it leads them to a man named Jonathan Small, who manages to elude their grasp for quite a while and presents quite a problem to track down. So, with a little help from the police and a high-speed boat chase, high speed being a relative term when your motor runs on steam and coal rather than on gasoline, but after a high-speed boat chase, they catch Small, and he tells them the whole story, and then everyone goes back to their normal everyday lives, which for Sherlock Holmes is doing cocaine and wondering about the scientific results of doing drugs, and Watson and Morstan start dating, and eventually in later stories they get married. So it's a detective story, it's a mystery, it's if you are a fan of mysteries, or if you are a fan of classic literature, you want to keep a sort of, if you want to brush up on things like this, then by all means go read this book. By all means go and add it to your collection of stories read, stories that you're familiar with. However, for this particular evaluation, I'm going to be taking the side of you shouldn't read this book. I would be trying to convince someone not to read this book. So I'm going to read the thesis now that I came up with for this particular paper. Remember, all your papers should have a thesis, and your thesis should include some version of why you should or shouldn't read this book, and then the points you're going to use to back it up. So remember you can do this without using the terms you or I, and it'll be just as effective, if not more so, because it stops being just simply opinion and starts being more of a statement of fact. So here's the thesis that I developed. While mystery and literature fans will want to read this book to maintain a complete collection of Sherlock Holmes stories, the average reader should steer clear of this book. Doyle's use of, or lack thereof, of detective work throughout, as well as his use of this theme known as the sign of the four, and the overall tone of the language and dialogue presented would convince, or should keep a reader from approaching this book, should keep a modern reader from approaching this book. Obviously, my thesis wasn't totally developed there towards the end, but you get the understanding there. It said whether or not you should read the book. It gave out 3 points of a reason why you shouldn't read the book, and then those 3 points would become the focus of your body paragraphs, of what you're actually going to discuss and provide examples of and analyze and things of that nature. So, does anyone have any questions at this point as to how you're supposed to get started with this? The thesis, all of that. The thesis should be one sentence. Now, the length of that sentence can vary. I mean, the thesis itself is just that statement. In my case, it was the average reader should steer clear of this book. That's the thesis statement. Now, the sentence that includes the thesis statement should be much more complex than that. As you can see, mine was all of two sentences, but there was a lead-in to the actual thesis, and then the points that I was going to use to support that idea were presented immediately after it. You could put it all together. You might want to practice putting it all together to say something along the lines of, or if I were doing that, I would say something like, the average reader should steer clear of this book because the lack of detective work throughout, the underuse of the sign of the four, and the strange yet appropriate for the time dialogue and language would keep the average individual from really being able to enjoy this book to its fullest extent. You know, one whole sentence, clear, concise, tells exactly what's going to happen. You don't need a whole lot more than that, and then you go right into the actual paper itself. So let's go ahead and talk about the first point that I wanted to make. I won't lay out anything. I don't have anything specifically written up that I'll read, but I want to talk about the ideas that I would use for this particular first point. This idea of the lack of detective work throughout. The reason why I say that is because you have several instances where the idea is that Sherlock Holmes is a master detective and that he can solve any case and that he is always coming up with new ideas and new challenges, and he's always managing to think of things and deduce issues that the normal person wouldn't possibly put together. And that's true. And this book also has some of that and utilizes his skill set. The only problem is that skill set is dreadfully underused in most of the book. The actual mystery solving, the actual deduction part is more or less over in 2 chapters. In the middle, chapters 5 and 6 or 6 and 7 is when he does all of his actual deduction work, and everything else, everything leading up to that is story related to, okay, how do we get into this mystery? Then you've got the deduction, and then you've got, okay, now we try and find the guy, which is a problematic in itself because they don't spend a whole lot of time actually utilizing, obviously that's the biggest problem, they don't spend a lot of time utilizing his skills to their fullest extent. So if that's the issue, and that's what I'm going to be discussing in this body paragraph section about the lack of detective work, then how do I support that? Well, there are several instances that I found that I would want to use. First, again, all his real work is being done over the course of 2 chapters. Second, there's a point in the book where Sherlock actually gives up. He can't deduce anything, he can't find the criminal, and so he just decides, okay, we're going to give up now, before kind of rallying and going back to try and do something. However, what he actually tries to do is not detective work, it's just go walk around and see what he can see. He's not actually trying to deduce anything more after that chapter 6, chapter 7-ish. A third point of evidence I would have used is the fact that the entire last chapter is about 20 to 25 pages of just long-winded wrap-up from the villain. The man who they catch, the man who's responsible for the murder, just tells the whole story. Holmes doesn't actually have to deduce much of what happened in the past and use the clues and everything that he knows. It just sort of, okay, let's tell the story and move on. Or let's tell the story and, that's the end. It kind of goes back, and this is a good point, this is a good time, because I know a lot of you asked about, can I use a book that's a part of a series? And I said, yeah, but don't focus on the series part of it, focus on the one book. And this is a good time to mention then that the first Sherlock Holmes book, A Study in Scarlet, did similar things. And actually, the entire second half of A Study in Scarlet is the villain's story, the villain's backstory. He's telling the story of how he got to the point of killing the people. And so it's the same thing repeated in book 2, a little bit less this time, but still it doesn't exactly make Holmes look like the master detective that we've all known him to be if he's not putting together what exactly happened in the past. Now, like I also said, each of these arguments, each of these points you're trying to make should have some measure of counter-argument to it as well. You should be discussing counter-arguments and be able to use them properly in your story or in your paper. The counter-argument to my first point, and one that someone could easily raise and easily discuss in a paper of their own, is the fact that perhaps the idea of the detective being this master solver and not having anything available to them in terms of information and being able to go from point A to point B with relatively little effort and relatively quick speed, and then be able to solve the entirety of the crime, not just, the crime itself, but also all the backstory, all of what happened in between and where he went and all what he ate the last 3 days and all of that, could have a lot to do with the fact that our impression of mystery and crime has become very stilted by TV drama and movies as well. We see mystery, there's how many murder mystery shows on the air right now, and they all have, high levels of energy and drama at all times, and they're trying to put all of this stuff together and make this case stick from beginning to end. And it's a different kind of beast, it's a different kind of world, it's a different kind of thing, and some of that may seep into how people perceive older mystery stories now. And you got to remember that The Sign of the Four was first published in 1890, so it was a huge revolution for its time in terms of the storytelling. Sherlock Holmes was the first instance of a magnifying glass ever being used as a detective tool. Before that didn't exist. In this book, he also used I assume it was a basset hound, to search out a scent, a common old police movie thing, and even something they use now with German Shepherds and other canine unit dogs. But it's all there. It's all these sorts of tropes and ideas that we know about being a crime solver, being a detective in this book published 125 years ago. So TV and movies might have influenced us a little bit, and that would be a very good counter argument to this point. The way that I would go about using that to my advantage would be to say that that's entirely possible, but TV and movies aren't the only thing responsible for Sherlock Holmes being lauded as the world's greatest detective. That also comes from Doyle himself, from the way this book was presented and the fact that all of these unique innovations in crime solving were used in these books 125 years ago. That is in itself a big reason why we believe Holmes to be the great detective, and to see him not being that, to see him not just failing, but complaining about it and trying to give up, is not exactly confidence building when it comes to this character and whether or not this character is worth investing the time in with this book. So any questions right now from anyone about these particular issues, or about this first issue here? Okay, then why don't we go ahead and I'll move on to my second point that I would be discussing, which is this recurring theme and the title of the book, The Sign of the Four. So, what was it? This would be a good time to give just a little bit of background on this idea, what it was. The Sign of the Four was the villain's name was Jonathan Small, and when he was stationed, or not really stationed, but a unwilling servant in the army stationed in India, he came across three other men who were plotting the murder of a very important prince, diplomat, king, whatever you want to call him, who had a £500,000 in jewels in a chest. They killed him and took the jewels and hid them, and then they created this sign of the four, which was a mark that they used to represent the pact that the four of them made to split the treasure evenly and be involved in this together. So here's the problem with the sign of the four and why why it doesn't inspire anyone to read the book. The biggest problem is that it seems like it's a big deal because it's the title of the book, but there's no real payoff for it. We don't get any explanation as to what it is until chapter 12, which is the last chapter, when Small is relaying the story of how it all came about. And even then, it seems like, okay, it's the pact that the four of them made. That's not really the sinister thing that you would expect from the title of a book like this. So there's not really a payoff for it, and there's not really any sort of sinister feeling to it as it's going through the book, which is problematic too, because as evidence to that fact, the sign of the four is only mentioned 7 times in the entire book. I was using the ebook version so I could look at how many times it actually showed up, and it was 7. It explains who the 4 people are, yes, but the bad guy, the murderer, explains who the 4 people were, sort of, in his explanation. 2 of them were Indian enlistees, I guess. Britain colonized India in the late 18th century, early 19th century, and then kind of not quite like what the Americans and Europeans did to people in Africa. The British in India kind of turned the Indian people into indentured servants, really, kind of against their will. Made them serve in the military, made them promises about what they were going to get if they were a part of it, and then never really delivered. So 2 of the men were other sort of indentured servants or prisoners in the British military, and then the third man was a bodyguard for the individual who was ultimately killed. So it explained who they were, but it never really seemed like it mattered. And that's sort of my point with this idea, is that it never really seemed like this whole idea of the sign of the four was actually important. Like it mattered for quite literally anything. It was underutilized. There were only 7 mentions of it total, and only 4 of those came before the actual story by Jonathan Small. So 4 times in the whole book before the explanation did this idea, did this sign, did this term appear. It's never fully utilized, it's never fully explained, which is kind of a letdown, because if you're going to title the book The Sign of the Four, there should be more payoff. I mean, Small was caught not really by detective work, but just kind of because the police boat could go faster than the one that he had, and then he just narrated the whole story, and the sign of the four was nothing. It was ultimately nothing. It was ultimately just seemingly a complete waste of a plot point or a theme or an element that could have been utilized much better to present a much more impactful story. And I know this is kind of off topic and not something I would discuss in the actual paper, but I wonder if some of that has to do with the fact that this is a book. Because I've read a couple of Doyle's short Sherlock Holmes stories, and those seem to be a lot tighter, a lot more deduction, a lot more just, hey, here's Sherlock going to tell you exactly how it happened because he figured it all out based upon some trampled grass and a broken twig or something like that. So I don't wonder if maybe Doyle should have stuck to writing these as short stories rather than trying to get into books. But he did write 4 of them for Sherlock, and this one, not one that the average reader should probably get too involved in. Okay, so the third point that I would have discussed that I would want to talk about in the actual paper would be this idea of language and dialogue. Now, it's especially important to mention that, again, that the book was written in 1890 at a point in time when Britain had colonies in India and in Southeast Asia in general, and there was a very commonly accepted bit of terminology for different people of different ethnicities, different nationalities, different religions even. And so it's not even necessarily that it needs to be a politically correct story, but the language, even accepting the fact that it was language of the day and language of how people responded or thought of others, is kind of off-putting and should be off-putting. I mean, like I said, to read this book for literature and literary purposes is one thing. To read it and be okay with sort of some of these depictions of anyone essentially non-white is a completely different thing. And it was a little off-putting in the language, and certainly I could understand if somebody didn't want to read this because of that issue. An example of this is a couple of quotes that I would include in the paper to support this point would be in chapter 7 there was a quote that was talking about Indians, and I assume as a whole probably Middle Eastern individuals, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Egypt, probably the entire area. The quote was, "The others are Hindus or Mohammedans." You can see that that's not exactly the kind of language you would like to hear when referring to other human beings, but there's not much you can do about the fact that these books were written at a time when that was the language used and that was the acceptable terminology applied to people. Another quote came from chapter 8 where Holmes said, quote, "The Hindu proper has long and thin feet. The sandal-wearing Mohammedan has the great toe well separated from the others, because the thong is commonly passed between." So you can see kind of a little bit of racial, well, not quite undertones, very explicit racial ideas of individuals around the world, individuals that the British Empire had interaction with as their impression of, or their idea of colonists, or whatever it happens to be. The colonized, I guess, would be the proper term for that. So it's a little off-putting, and then to kind of go along with that, a general idea in this whole notion of post-colonial literature, or middle colonial literature, actually, for some of this, because if I remember correctly, when did the British when did India gain its independence? I think it was 1947 when India finally gained its independence from Britain. So the middle of sort of that occupation. But other depictions. Jonathan Small, the villain, the bad guy, the murderer, whatever you want to call him, had a tiny, a short, little. It's not bad if it's long. It shouldn't be too long because you don't want to spend a whole lot of time on. You don't want to waste too much of the paper talking about your introduction and your thesis. It should probably be about a half a page if you've got it down and you've got it just so. So a half a page should be where you're shooting for an introduction for a paper of this length. It's and that should include all the background information you need, ideally all of the summary you're going to need, and your thesis as well. Which a half a page would probably be somewhere in the neighborhood of 200, 250 words, which is what you're supposed to be doing for the annotated bibliography, so it may not be a bad idea to get some extra practice with that now. So the other kind of the way that individuals were discussed and talked about, the Jonathan Small's partner or the person who worked with him was described as a very small black man who was similar. He was a full-grown man, but whose appearance was more like that of a child, and there was that constant language of calling him a savage because he came from a quote-unquote uncivilized part of the world or things of that nature. So this kind of depiction of humans, this depiction of, or the stereotyping through language, whether appropriate or not, is maybe a reason that somebody would want to avoid this book. I mean, it can be off-putting, and certainly it's right to maybe feel a little uncertain and a little kind of taken aback by its use and its presence in any book. So it's a reason why someone may want to avoid this book. So those are the three that I had, and you could see I used some evidence. I was pulling out examples from the text itself. I was using quotes to help support it, and then kind of explaining why they matter and why they would be reasons to avoid things, taking into account counter arguments and all of that as well. Any questions right now about the paper? Anything that you're curious about? Anything that you want to know more about? Okay, do you all feel a little bit more comfortable tackling this? I know that there's only a couple of days still before it's due, so do you feel like you're at a point now where you could, if you weren't already there, that you feel you could do this assignment without too much trouble? Yeah, it was a general question. And Cyrus, I know that um, you need to. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. Start a summary from the beginning of a series of books. The summary should just be about the one book, so it shouldn't be too. I mean, obviously that's easy enough to do. So, like I said, you don't want to necessarily mention the other books other than as sort of a way to kind of push the story or push your own argument forward rather than um, actually discussing every book in the series. I mean, you can still provide a summary of just the one book and work with it. Why do you have mixed feelings? Or what do you have mixed feelings about? Well, if you thought you knew how to do it, then by all means, go ahead and write that way. I mean, we still have for some of you, we still have peer review tomorrow, so you can ask more questions and certainly get feedback. I mean, I'm going to be listening to what you're reading, and so just get as much feedback as you can so that you know what's going on, so that you have a better sense of what everyone else is doing, and you can get any sort of feedback you need in order to move forward. Well, I mean, you know, we can look at it again tomorrow and make sure that it's what you're supposed to be doing or point you in the right direction. I mean, certainly, it's not too late to make sure that you're on the right path. What else? Any other questions about the paper? Lawrence, did you go to the ALC? Were they able to work with you? Because I've seen mixed things in the reports that I've gotten on the various papers from whether or not I would agree that they were effective. Okay, good. I'm glad they've helped some of you. The only reason, I mean, I'm never going to knock the Writing Center because I worked at a Writing Center and I know that they are very helpful and very worthwhile for students. I think really what it comes down to is just the explanation that I see of what they, the explanation of what I see as to what you went over in with them is never a never a complete picture of what I'm sure you talked about. So, you know, when I get a very brief summary, clearly they haven't taken my class to learn how to summarize properly, which maybe they should. I don't know. But the summary I see of your lessons or sessions with them, they don't necessarily hit on or it sometimes concerns me what I see as to whether or not they're actually hitting on the right things, or whether or not you and they were able to figure out the assignment properly in order to get necessary and correct feedback on your draft. But if you guys say it's working and you think it's being helpful, then absolutely. And I mean, everyone should go and utilize the service to some extent because it's a great one to have available. It's not something that the schools have to provide, and it's not something that your peers have to participate in to help you with your work. So use it because it's awesome. Any other questions about the paper, about what you're doing, about anything that's bothering you with the class, whatever it happens to be? Okay, if nobody has anything that they are dying to know, then we will call it a night there. This video will be online here immediately after the live stream ends, and then you'll be able to use it. Hopefully everyone who couldn't make it tonight will at least check it out this weekend, because I'm sure all of you are going to be trying your best to finish it up, since it's due on either Monday or Tuesday, depending upon which class you're in. So good luck finishing up. I will see some of you tomorrow, and the rest of you I will see either Monday or Tuesday, depending upon which class you happen to be in. So have a good night, everyone, and I will see you soon.